If you sort of zoom out, you look like we are right now in the middle of this like explosion of something. We don't know what it's going to end up like, but I do believe, as you alluded to earlier, that scenarios in which we just remain more or less like we are now and have the current human condition just keep going for like tens of thousands of years, that just seems extremely improbable to me, relative to either like extinction / dystopia or some radical transformation into some kind of post-human condition.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 205. And this episode is with Nick Bostrom, a philosopher of artificial intelligence and many other subjects, who was most recently professor of philosophy at Oxford University, where he also served as the founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute. Nick is likely best known in the public eye for his work on the simulation argument, which is the idea that we live not in the familiar physical world that we believe we inhabit, but a simulation of one. But he's also well known for his book Superintelligence, which covers the dangers of artificial intelligence and strategies for dealing with them. In this episode, though, Nick and I talk about his more recent book, Dystopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World, which just came out in March, actually, and as opposed to getting into the existential dangers of AI, which Nick tackles in Superintelligence, Dystopia considers the sorts of concerns that might arise if everything actually goes right with AI. So after talking about the alignment problem and some other fundamental issues in the philosophy of AI, we talk about the problems that might come from having perfect technology, from immortality, from not having to work anymore, from having robots that can do all your hobbies better than you can do, and more. Likes, comments, subscribes, reviews, as you know, all of these things are always extremely appreciated. There is also a Patreon if you would like a link to an ad-free RSS feed or show notes. And to all those of you who are patrons, who are geeslings, thank you so much for your support. But now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Nick. You're one of the most widely recognized philosophers in the public sphere, and mainly known in that capacity, I think, for thinking about dystopian AI scenarios and other existential threats. So right off the bat, I'm wondering what motivated this shift to thinking about utopias.
Both sides have always been present in my mind and my outlook. Back when I was writing Superintelligence, this 2014 book, which was in the works 6 years prior to that, I felt it was more urgent to focus on what could go wrong with AI, figure out where the pitfalls were so that we could avoid them. This was a time at which the whole idea of AI posing any kind of existential risk or even just having any kind of transformative impact on society was still far outside the mainstream. The whole idea of the alignment problem was not in the Overton window. There were like maybe a handful of people scattered around the world, kind of internet types, who were trying to work on this. And it just seemed hugely neglected to me. So I thought writing this book, Superintelligence, trying to develop concepts that would make it possible for people to start to think more constructively about this and begin to do research on developing scalable methods for AI alignment was important. In the intervening years, we've seen a big shift. Now all the frontier AI labs have research teams specifically trying to develop scalable methods for AI control. And there are many other organizations as well, where a lot of the smartest young people I know now are like flooding into this field. And in the last 2 years, we've also seen a big shift at the level of policy conversation, where even top-tier policymakers are now beginning to recognize the transformative impact of future AI development, with statements coming out from the White House. And the UK hosted this global summit on AI. I was just the other week in Brussels for a high-level meeting. And so So to some extent, that whole thing is now, widely recognized, and many people are working on it. I felt the other side of what happens if things go right with AI had not yet really been addressed, or people talk about it, but often in a rather superficial way. But once you start to dig in, you realize there are actually quite deep, even philosophical problems that come up when you imagine, like, what would give human life purpose and meaning in this condition, where in a solved world, as I call it, like, where all practical problems that can be solved through progress have already been solved. And so that's how the book, it wasn't really so much a plan to write the book. It more kind of happened, as sometimes is the way of these things. Like, you start writing a little and then it takes on a life of its own, and you just try to hold on as the thing gradually develops.
Mm-hmm. I can tell that this book really did take on a life of its own, just because of the various formats in which you wrote it. And there's poetry, there's dialogue, there's standard exposition. So it was clearly a very creative project in a way that, philosophical articles are still creative, but it's more of an intellectual creativity than an artistic creativity.
Yeah. Some people maybe think there should have been a sort of more tough-minded editor hovering over me to kind of, but it actually does serve a purpose. Well, for a start, it's less a book about conclusions than it is about questions and exploration. And I think this format with multiple different characters and voices helps you explore several different sides, giving each one their due and letting them speak for themselves, different values. So that's one reason for, I think, the form kind of works for the content. The other is that the goal of the book is, well, in part to try to give the reader various concepts and considerations and such, so they can, better think about these things. But another part is to try to put somebody in the right frame of mind for confronting this. If you imagine there will actually perhaps at some point be some group of people who will have to form some opinions about what we want long-term from these AI developments, whether it's a few people in some lab or a government or some more humanity-wide deliberation process. These are really difficult questions to deliberate about, and I would like people who go into that to come at it with a certain attitude. So a kind of broad-minded generosity combined with some playfulness and thoughtfulness and open-mindedness, which I'm hoping the book encourages. And I think that those creative elements are also meant to contribute to that. That it is a long read. So it is also maybe an antidote to short attention spans, if you...
Well, but before we move on to some of the substantive issues, just a couple of comments. It really was a great way of delivering a number of concepts to the reader. Before reading this book, I just thought of utopia as kind of a blanket concept, but now I realize, and we'll get into it, there are various different types of utopias, each of which have their own problems and considerations to keep in mind. And then you said that this book tackles very deep problems about meaning, and it's also, I think, very useful as a thought experiment for testing, an extended thought experiment for testing our intuitions about meaning in the present. So it's not just like it's useful for these future utopian scenarios, it's very useful for thinking about our lives today. For instance, there's a passage on shopping that resonated with me very much as somebody who enjoys shopping. But returning to the substance, two things that you mentioned right at the outset that I think we should pin down for our listeners who might not have read Superintelligence are, one, what superintelligence is, since that's vital for the understanding of a deep utopia, and then also what this alignment problem is, because even though we will presuppose that it has been solved for a lot of this conversation, I think it's still important to understand what it is.
Yeah, well, so superintelligence is kind of any intellectual system that radically outperforms all humans in all cognitive fields, and so including, scientific creativity, wisdom, strategy, like the full range, really. And the alignment problem is the technical question of how, if you figured out how to make an AI that's generally capable of learning and planning and reasoning, how could you then steer it in some particular direction to make sure that even when it becomes much smarter than its creator, it still does what it's supposed to do, like what you intended for it to do, that it's kind of on our side, as opposed to becoming this antagonistic force that has different goals than we tried to give it, that then works at cross purposes with ours, broadly speaking. And there are different ways that different people have tried to make that precise, but that is more or less the gist of it. So yeah, this book kind of just assumes, or like postulates really, that all of that, the alignment problem is solved. Also that the governance problems are solved to whatever extent they can be solved, so that imagine we actually don't use this powerful technology to wage war against each other or to oppress each other, and that all these things that can be solved have been solved to whatever extent possible, in order then to actually get to the point where we can ask these questions about value. I have, of course, a lot of things to say in my other writings about these issues of getting from here to there. But there is a risk that if one starts to write about those, one never actually gets to consider what it's all for, ultimately. We are, and I think this holds in general with our existences as well. We are very busy, putting one foot in front of the other, and maybe don't always take the time to reflect on where we are going, or and especially at the civilizational level. A lot of effort is being put into making progress, like growing the economy, improving the technology, making things more efficient. But nobody really seems to have a clear notion of where does this lead us to in 50 years time, in 500 years time. But anyway, that's all kind of. Now, I don't know whether superintelligence is strictly speaking like a premise, or it certainly is one technology, which if we had that, it would unlock a lot of other technological affordances, and you would more quickly approximate this condition of a solved world. But you could, in principle, imagine getting there just through a slower accumulation of human-driven automation. You could maybe imagine in the limit, just as you can create a little program that automates a specific task on your computer, or create a robot that makes one action in a car factory or something. If we just kept doing that for 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years, maybe eventually we would have software and robots that could do all the tasks, and you could kind of at least get close to a similar situation without superintelligence.
Mm-hmm. You said that, so both the dystopian and the utopian sides of the coin were always on your mind from the beginning, but at the time you wrote Superintelligence, though it had been gestating for 7 or 8 years, you thought it was more a more pressing problem to deal with the alignment problem and the pitfalls of AI. But what I'm wondering is, so there was a practical element in writing Superintelligence. I don't want to get bogged down in how we get from here to superintelligence, because as you mentioned, that can take us very far afield, and we won't actually ever get to the utopian questions. But is there also a sort of practical dimension to writing about deep utopia because you think it is near at hand and we need to start thinking about it? Or is it more at this point just a philosophical exercise?
It's more the former for me, actually. I mean, I do think we are on a seemingly fast track towards the AI transition. And so it does give the whole set of questions greater practical urgency. And they might be relevant in all sorts of ways. Like there might, for example, be points at which we may need to make some trade-offs between taking on risks and undergoing this transition sooner versus delaying it in order to hopefully make it safer, although that exposes us to other risks independent of AI. But and some of this might hinge on how urgent we think it is to improve upon or get out of the current human condition into something better. If you think that anything on the other side is like bad, right, then you might just want to preserve the status quo for as long as possible. If you think there is this like very wonderful utopia on the other side, then maybe you think, well, let's make sure we get there before we all just die from aging or something, and it would be worth taking some risk to make sure that we can reach that point. So these questions do, I think, flow back possibly to decisions that people have to make. But the main use case would be this: if people are at one point having to design the trajectory forward, and maybe they, with AI advice, are able to anticipate where it will lead. And like, one trajectory maybe leads to some kind of hedonism maximizing outcome. Another leads to some other complex situation. A third might lead to some kind of radically planetary sized brains optimized for, processing scientific knowledge or something. And if some people need to make some judgments about the relative desirability of these, then I think it would be good if they had thought more about it than their sort of decisions were not merely reflecting on the latest thing they had happened to read on Twitter, or like how they happen to feel that day. Like if they wake up in a good mood, they think, it's the future is great and has a lot of opportunity. If they happen to wake up depressed, they kind of are a nihilist and think it would be better if the world just disappeared. And ideally, whatever decision is made should reflect a kind of broader set of considerations and values and perspectives than that. And so, contributing to that. And I guess one more thing to be said about that is that the prospect of the future going well, I think, is greater if people have this sense of there being great possibilities to realize not just one value, but many values. That if the future goes well, it unlocks this huge, would have this super advanced technology, plentiful resources, a lot of time, and there would be a kind of abundance. And I think that can help people approach things in a more generous way than if there is extreme scarcity and like one person's gain is another's loss and there is not enough for everybody. Then it's very hard to be generous, right? It's easier to be generous if you have a lot. And so thinking ahead, if we could approach the future in this more cooperative and generous way, I think that also reduces the risk of various dystopian outcomes and improves the prospect. So those are some thoughts in the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to speak, I guess, a little bit proverbially, though, that abundance has its own problems, because what is a pleasure without pain? And when we have everything, this is a big part of the book and your project, is where we find meaning in a world where we have everything and there is no scarcity to drive purpose in various
right. Ways. Yeah. So that's like the kind of the problem then that one confronts. So much of our lives currently are structured around the various practical necessities that we face in our life. So you have to go into work every day because you need to get the paycheck, which you need to pay the rent. You have to brush your teeth because otherwise your gum will decay, and you have to do this, that, and you have like this, like so much of our lives are just like doing something in order for something else to be caused as a result. Right. And that kind of fills our life with sort of goal-oriented activity. But in this solved world, a very large chunk of all of that would no longer be needed. Like you wouldn't humans wouldn't have to engage in economically productive labor because AIs and robots could do everything that needed to be done. You wouldn't have to like spend an hour at the gym working out in order to be fit and healthy, because you could pop a pill that would give you the same physiological effects. And you can kind of go through activity by activity, and you find that for many of them, you can sort of either cross them out or at least put a question mark on top of them, that although you could still do them at technological maturity, they would seem to be a kind of pointlessness hanging over them like a dark cloud. Mm-hmm. That maybe remove some of their value. And so, and this is like, I think, part of what would make, from our current vantage point, some of these scenarios, at least prima facie, look unattractive. we kind of base our self-worth and dignity on the sense of doing something useful, like you're a breadwinner, or maybe you contribute to society in some other way, or like you look after your kids or your grandkids, and you like through your efforts and strivings, like you actually make the world better in some way that it could not otherwise be. And if that's removed, then there's a void that the utopians would have to somehow fill in.
I think a lot of the fun in this project comes from your imagination and looking at all the various examples of what life might be like and the technologies that might be available in what you refer to as a technologically mature society. And I want to talk about those things, but before we do, I mentioned earlier that there were, I'm not sure if it was 5 or 6, I think 5 different utopias that you discuss in the book, whereas I had just only ever thought there's one kind of utopia, it's just heaven, and I had left that unanalyzed, heaven or something like heaven where everything's perfect. But what are the different types of utopia that you think are relevant to this discussion, and how do they differ, and what are some of the basic problems that they confront the utopia dweller with?
Yeah, so this is how I classify them for my purposes. But you could think of a first category of sort of culture and politics utopias. Many of the classical works fall into this category, where basically the author tries to imagine a better political system or a better sort of culture. So maybe you think there would be a different system of governance, or like the gender roles would be defined differently, or the way that children relate to their parents. And then different authors have different views about the optimal way to arrange this, and the optimal way would then be a utopia. Now, a slightly more, I guess, radical, or like at least in one dimension more radical conception of utopia would be an abundance utopia, where you imagine that there is plenty to go around, so all material needs are abundantly supplied. And you do also find some of these in the historical records. Like there was a kind of medieval fantasy of the land of Cockine that's was a kind of peasant vision of like the ideal life. The rivers would flow with wine, and roasted turkeys would kind of drop down on the plate, and there would be music and dancing and a lot of time for relaxing. And you can see, if you were like a kind of agricultural laborer, like doing backbreaking work from morn to dusk, and then just to have barely enough porridge to eat, like this would already be like a fantastic conception, right? Like you could eat as much as you want. You could just stuff yourself with food and rest all day, and like that. So that would be kind of an abundance utopia. And then we have a kind of post-work utopia, which is different from abundance utopia, in that not only is there plenty of everything, but humans don't need to work to produce it. And this is about as far as most mainstream conversation has gone in the context of AI. You do find some economists who are starting to think about automation and whether it could cause unemployment, and if so, what would happen? Like, you maybe need some universal basic income, etc. Like in Marx's Utopia, he doesn't write very much about it, but it seems he imagines there would be a sort of certainly a culture politics utopia according to his conception, and then there would be like less work and more abundance, but people would still be working. So it's kind of, but I think there are levels beyond that you could consider, which is much more radical and poses much more deep problems in terms of human values. So we have a post-instrumental utopia, where it is not just the need for human economic labor that is rendered odious by technological progress, but the need for all human labor that is instrumental in character. So, I mean, I mentioned like you might have to labor at the gym to be fit, but that you wouldn't have to do in Utopia. Right now, if you want to understand mathematics, you have to first study mathematics and spend hours working on exercise problems and like really exerting yourself, right? But in this condition of technological maturity, there would be shortcuts to the same end. You could imagine some swarm of nanobots infiltrating your brain and rewiring your synapses into a condition where you now possess mathematical knowledge without you having to put out any effort. So that kind of, pulls the rug out of a wider range of human activity and exertion, not just like the job that you go and do for 8 hours a day, but most of what fills the rest of your time. And then there's like a final stage beyond that, which is I call a plastic utopia, which has all the attributes of a post-instrumental utopia. But in addition, the human organism itself becomes malleable and subject to our wishes and desires. So you could sort of choose what emotions you want to have, or what thoughts you want to have, or what moral character you want to have, or what like physiology. You have technologies to kind of reshape yourself at will, including your psychological states. And that then results in this kind of solved or almost dissolved world where like all the kind of hard limitations that we currently face like are removed, it seems. And the only thing that remains are kind of our values that I think have been shaped under this condition of scarcity, which has like always been there for humans throughout history. It's almost like formed an exoskeleton, these practical needs. And if you were to remove all of those practical necessities, there is like the question of what happens to the soft squishy parts. Like, do they just become a blob, like a drugged out, a kind of pleasure blob, or can they take some more interesting shape? So that's like the main. There are a couple of early chapters that talk about some of these more economic and technological, but then the bulk of the issue is really set in this condition of a solved world that is plastic and post-instrumental.
I'd like to digress for a moment to this mathematics case that you brought up, which I find particularly compelling myself, especially because it's an example of something I said earlier, where I think examining what a mathematician might do in, let's say, a post-instrumental utopia might tell us something about what mathematicians do and value today that might not readily be apparent. So in this post-instrumental world where we have extremely powerful automated theorem provers that might enumerate all the theorems of math and all the interesting axiomatic systems, and there's no longer a role for mathematicians to be providing new proofs, do you think mathematicians would still be around? Because, I mean, this is something that isn't... This is one element of utopia that might not be that far out, unlike some other ones, because we already have automated theorem provers that are doing work that mathematicians can't do.
Yeah, so people play chess, even though we have computers that can play much better chess, or solve crossword puzzles, even though there is no need for crossword puzzles to be solved, and do a lot of other things currently, right? So the first answer one might think is, yeah, sure, we'll just do it anyway because it's fun. Now, I think we can't stop at that point. We need to unpack this idea that we do it because it's fun. So that could mean we do it because it gives us pleasure. Somebody who is fascinated with mathematics probably derive pleasure from engaging in mathematical thinking and occasionally maybe finding a solution. But if that's the only reason, there would be, again, shortcuts to attaining pleasure in a solved world. You could have more direct forms of brain manipulation that would stimulate your pleasure centers. I mean, you could imagine it as some sort of a super duper drug without side effects and addiction potential, or more likely some direct way of manipulating the relevant neural structures. Maybe we're all digital at that point anyway, and you just... and so, yeah, if all you wanted was to experience positive affect, there would be no need to do mathematics for that purpose. So if you do nevertheless think that it would be better to do mathematics, you then, it seems, value something other than just this hedonic state that you now very imperfectly and grudgingly, like maybe like some little drips of pleasure is derived every once in a while when somebody who is enjoying mathematics does mathematics. And there's probably just a lot of sort of boring, futile effort and like uncomfortable straining to get to those occasional little drips of reward. That's the stingy way our current reward systems are architected, right? So you could kind of open the floodgates to that and then have a kind of more blissed out psychological condition. And so that's easy to dismiss. A lot of people like immediately think that, wow, that's like, what a horrific view of the future that is. We're all kind of like junkies sprawled on some sort of flea-infested mattress, but with like a super drug dripping into our nucleus accumbens. It might well be that ultimately we want and can have more than that, but it is actually a rather deep question whether we shouldn't dismiss too quickly the super bliss as an element of what we would ultimately choose and have reason to choose, perhaps. Nevertheless, I think we can have that and have a whole bunch of other things on top of that maybe satisfy other plausible value candidates. So certainly, if you do think that it is good to engage in certain types of activity, you could do that as well. There is no reason. You could have complex experiences, pleasure plus complex experiences plus various forms of goal-directed activity, but where and we can talk more about why you would be adopting various goals if you were in this post-instrumental situation, but and then perhaps some additional elements even beyond that you could kind of reconstitute some of the prerequisites for instantiating human values even in this solved world condition.
I think what motivated my asking this question was reflecting on two conversations I had in the past on the show. One was with a renowned number theorist at Columbia University named Michael Harris that we had a couple of years ago, so it's a little faint in my mind. And another is with Stephen Wolfram. And we were talking about math in a world in which all of math is essentially automatable. And today, I think our folk view of what mathematicians are in the business of is just producing new proofs, discovering or inventing, depending on your philosophical view, more facts to be added to this big book of math. But what Michael Harris said, and what I think Stephen Wolfram agreed with, is that mathematicians aren't just in the business of producing new facts, they're in the business of understanding. That's what really drives what they're doing, is they want to understand these structures. And I was thinking that in this post-instrumental world, when mathematicians no longer have to produce proofs, they still would be very interested in understanding and maybe teaching mathematics. But then this raises another problem that I hadn't considered yet, that you discuss in some of the later or the more advanced types of utopia, where we have a matrix-like system of downloading information, where there's into our brains, where there's no longer any real barrier to understanding. You can understand anything as soon as you just download it into your mind. So there's not really an activity of being a mathematician anymore. Just if you want to understand the math, then you press a button and you understand the math.
Yeah. So this is a very advanced level of technology, and it's a little unclear exactly how close to this we could get. But certainly, if you imagine a human upload, like a digitized version of a human mind, and then you have on the outside some machine superintelligence that is able to understand how the neural network that is you sometimes successfully can grasp mathematical concepts and in other cases fail, and what variations of your neural network would be required, like what edits, to make it as similar as possible to you now, but with this extra mathematical understanding. I think it possibly would be the case that the job of working out how to adjust the various parameters in your brain to give you this mathematical knowledge could be outsourced to this machine superintelligence that is looking at a model of your brain, and probably be able to do that without actually running a detailed simulation of your brain, which if that were the only way for the superintelligence to work it out, you might then think, well, you would actually then be instantiated in the simulation and you would have to put in the effort, although the simulated version of you would do. But I think probably you would be able to move up levels of abstraction to more or less obviate that need. And so that you would then be able to, in effect, download skills or knowledge without having to put in time studying. And so, and the teaching of mathematics is even more obvious. I mean, I think we are very close now to having tutorial systems that would be much better than most like high school mathematics. I mean, aside from keeping the class disciplined and making sure everybody sits at their desk or whatever, but the actual instruction, I'd imagine maybe even ChatGPT-4 would be a better explainer than most high school teachers, because it can keep track of exactly where you are, where you get stuck on a particular problem, and sort of customize its explanation for you, as opposed to doing something generic for the class of 30.
Just curious, are you drawing the sort of distinction between ChatGPT or GPT-4 being a good high school teacher and a good university level professor because maybe there is insufficient training data on university level material for ChatGPT to be able to explain it better than a university professor could?
I mean, I don't know exactly. I'd imagine there would need to be some fine tuning maybe to adapt these large language models for specific use cases in the classroom. I'd imagine the standard university courses like, first and second calculus and like all of that stuff, probably it would be able to explain, I'd imagine, as well as a mathematics professor. I think maybe once you get to the research level of mathematics, where it's more a matter of taste, and then I'm not sure the current language models are quite yet there yet, where they would be as good as like a decent mathematics professor in terms of figuring out whether a research direction is promising, or whether some proposal for say a PhD is like the right level of difficulty that the student could possibly do it in 4 years. And I think there is there's obviously less training data written up for ingestion, and also it involves the most high level human faculties that haven't yet perhaps quite been attained by the current generation of systems.
A term of art that you introduce in the book that I referenced earlier is technological maturity. And I also mentioned that this is one of the very fun things for me of reading Deep Utopia, because we get to see your imagination at work and all the possible things that a technological mature society might have at its fingertips, so to speak. So how do you define a technologically mature society, and what are some of the things that people might expect to be able to do or have on offer?
Yeah, so it's like a condition at which all those technological affordances that are consistent with the laws of physics, and for which there is some possible trajectory from where we are now to their development exists. It might be that you can't ever, strictly speaking, attain perfect technological maturity, but in reality you might get some kind of close approximation to it if you have developed all the most useful general purpose technologies.
Is perfect technological maturity being able to do anything that's physically possible?
Well, I would also have this pathway there, but it might just be that if you imagine there are kind of an unlimited number of more and more specialized technologies for doing specific things, it might be possible to develop any like small subset of them by like investing your R&D resources. But if there is like quadrillions and quadrillions of different very specialized technologies, maybe you can't develop the whole set of them. But I think there would be sort of ways of getting close to that for most practical purposes. Like once you have superintelligence and nanotechnology, you can sort of come up with, the superintelligence can make arbitrary designs and the nanotech can sort of put it together. And then like some other things, you can, I think, get pretty close to that. So, and I think we know already at least some lower bounds of what such a condition of technological maturity would involve. That is technologies that we can already have good reason to think are physically possible and for which there is a pathway such that we could, at least in the fullness of time, under favorable condition, get there. So superintelligence is one of these. Like, I think, perfect virtual reality of the sort that would be indistinguishable to the person inside the physical, like virtual reality from ordinary basic reality would be another affordance. I think like cures for aging, uploading into computers, space colonization at large intergalactic scales, perfect neurotechnology in the sense of being able to control precisely our hedonic and emotional states, cognitive augmentations, like many other things as well. But at least that already gives you a huge set of possible of things you can do, right? That technological maturity.
Mm-hmm. So the way that for our listeners who haven't looked at the book yet, the book is organized so it's kind of like a course you're teaching to these imaginary students, and at various points in the book there are handouts where you've summarized some of the material, and I have handout number 2, some capabilities at technological maturity, on the screen before me, and I was just glancing at them. And one that jumped out at me is the possibility of Dyson spheres for harvesting the energy output of stars. And this comes to mind for 2 reasons. One is, well, I'll just focus on one, but the reason is I've done a number of episodes on string theory and been thinking a lot about string theory lately. And one of the big barriers to empirical confirmation of string theory is that we cannot generate enough energy to probe sufficiently small distances to confirm the existence of strings. And people have conjectured that the sort of energy you would need is the energy of a star. So it looks like we'll be able to confirm or disconfirm string theory in this.
A very useful technology, the Dyson sphere.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, like you mentioned, arbitrary sensory inputs, reversal of aging, uploading of biological brains into computers, and all of these things engender their own host of philosophical questions to be asked and answered. Aligned police bots and automatic treaty enforcement. I mean, and police bots are already a question being asked today. But, reversal of aging and cures for all diseases, that's one that jumps out at me, or a couple that jump out at me right now. Are there any particular problems that would need to be dealt with in these later stage utopias if we just lived forever?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one would be the size of the population, which is able to increase exponentially, and if nobody dies, then at some point the rate of births would have to match the rate of acquisition of new resources in order to maintain high per capita incomes. Because at technological maturity, there wouldn't be increases in productivity. Like, that's one of the things that drive technological growth now, right? Even if the resources are the same, you could have better technologies to make more efficient use of them, but that will have maxed out. And so then the only way that the economy could grow at that point is if more resources are attained through expanding in space. But that can at most happen at a polynomial rate, like you have a bubble that is growing in all directions at some significant fraction of the speed of light, and the volume of that grows as a polynomial of time, whereas the population could grow exponentially, right? And so then eventually you would have a Malthusian condition. And so in the limit, you would need to sort of make sure the rate of population increase, which might be sort of digital minds making copies of themselves, right? That would kind of at most match the rate at which the resource endowment increases. Like another maybe more philosophically interesting question, if we eliminated aging, and then, I mean, right now what would happen if you eliminated aging is that people would die from accidents and wars, but maybe with a lifespan of a few thousand years, if you kind of calculate the rate of death by accident. Now, hopefully, we will bring down the rate of accidents and war. Certainly in Utopia, you'd imagine that to go way down. And if you could upload yourself to computers, then you could make backup copies and stuff, and then the rate of accidents could kind of become arbitrarily small. So then you might have very long lifespans, even astronomical, and that presents more interesting philosophical questions for human values. In that, well, first of all, we don't know what would happen to, like, if you remained a human mind of like a brain with your current size and the number of synapses and stuff. Like, we know you can continue to learn and develop and grow for like 100 years, but we don't even know what would happen if a human just kept living for 400 years. Like, would you go stale and rigid and like, and even if that didn't happen in a sort of like neurological way, like, then it might still be that, and it's a hard question to sort of gauge, but that the number of different types of things that can be done with a human mind and body in a human world is finite, and is that number is small enough that it would become relevant, so that at some point you would just run out of interesting new things to do. And if so, how long? Like, I mean, I think given that we are finite, there has to be some number of years after which you would literally be doing the same thing you'd already done. But if that is kind of 10 to the power of 100 or something, we might not have to care very much, because we die anyway before that from the heat death of the universe. But if the answer is like 10,000 years, like after 10,000 years, you'd basically just repeat yourself, then either you'd have to accept that such lives will have a diminution of a certain kind of novelty, and that may be a price to admittance in this kind of extreme longevity in Utopia, or you would have to perhaps start to level up after you have spent 10,000 years being a human. Maybe then you would want to become a transhuman, like increase your intellectual faculties or something, and you could kind of start to tackle the next level of challenges and keep developing that way. But it is, I think it is one direction in which you can kind of take our current human values and where they start to become strained. If you just imagine the current human lifespan with our current values and our current faculties, but just extended and like prevented from physical disease. Like, at some point, I think that would possibly become unattractive. Like, there are still a lot of things in human life that don't require novelty. I mean, like a cup of tea is like about as good like the 10,000th time as it is the second time or first time, right? They're like renewable pleasures. And sometimes you could run the argument that sometimes the best things in life are the little things, that it's not like the big dramatic narrative climaxes, but it's like, you know, the smell of autumn air in the evening along a stroll along the coast, or like looking into your loved one's face, or a little, you know, a cup of tea or whatever, like these little things. Sometimes, you know, you could run the argument that that's a fairly high quality value, although we give them kind of short shrift.
An interesting connection to the philosophical literature going back hundreds of years. I mean, is how conceptions of personal identity might shift in this world where we live indefinitely. I think, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Locke who proposed that personal identity has something to do with memory and psychological connectedness, and maybe it was Derek Parfit in his sort of ongoing discourse with David Lewis, who questioned whether somebody who wasn't immortal would eventually no longer be the same person that they started out as, because they would not remember, let's say, their childhood. There would no longer be any psychological connection to a person stage thousands and thousands of years earlier. And in this sort of utopia, maybe we would bypass this by getting memory implants or memory chip implants so that we could just continually add new memories and maintain internal psychological connectedness.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there is, first of all, like, I would want to retain the distinction between long time and infinity. Like immortality, I think should mean not dying, not just taking a while before you die, like conceptually. And it is important because immortality in that strict sense just might be impossible in our physical universe and be the preserve of, say, more theological scenarios. And from the view of eternity, like whether you live for like 80 years or 80,000 years, it's kind of in some sense the same, right? It's an infinitesimal short relative to infinity either way. Now, I do think that, yes, increasing, I call it time suits, but the idea that we could make some modifications to us that make us better able to survive radical change without having our identity eroded or our values corrupted. So the most obvious thing would be to improve our episodic memory so that you actually don't just forget what you've been through. And that could make you sort of remain relevantly the same for longer than if you just have like the memory of a goldfish. And you could imagine some other tweaks as well that would allow us to sort of endure for longer periods of time, and upgrading our capacities in different ways could help with that. But even if it came to a point where you would have to accept some loss of personal continuity in whatever relevant sense, I mean, it might be acceptable. Like if you have a 5-year-old and you know that if there were a pill that would just arrest their development, then they would remain a 5-year-old. Like in some sense, maybe a year from now, that would be more similar to what they're now than if they're just allowed to freely develop. But we might still think it's better for them to grow up. Like in some sense, you're the same person now as you were when you were 5, but realistically, you're also quite different, right? In many ways. And maybe that's not an unambiguously bad thing. Like, and so I think the combination of these, we can reduce the negative effects of various kinds of corroding consequences of the passage of time through improving memory and certain other positive attributes, and like also include like maybe extending your planning horizon, etc. And then also accepting some degree of change, even if it does mean that you eventually move further away from what you once were. There's still a difference between that and just dying, because at any given point in time, you might look forward to hundreds of years of existing in some very similar thing to your current condition, and you would gradually sort of, see new ways of doing things or being or new experiences. That feels a lot more optimistic to me than like a kind of you're going to be shot tomorrow morning, right? And so this smoother and gentler way of losing our connection with the past seems perhaps prudentially preferable, even to the extent that it is unavoidable relative to the alternative.
Okay, not that a lot of this or all of it hasn't all been speculative, but I have a particularly speculative question to ask. So when I spoke with Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist, this brings us back to Dyson spheres. He conjectured that Oumuamua, this comet that passed us by in, I believe, 2017, might have been part of a Dyson sphere. And you have made your own very, I don't know if splashy is an adjective, but powerful, controversial conjectures about, for instance, whether or not we might be in a simulation. And I'm wondering if you think it is possible or likely even that there are societies out there that have already reached, for instance, a post-scarcity utopian stage, because I think having a Dyson sphere, if whoever sent Oumuamua our way had a Dyson sphere, we would classify them probably as being in a post-scarcity period, assuming that they still have other Dyson spheres.
Yeah, post-scarcity, they might not. I mean, it depends a lot on what their goals are. And it might be that the Dyson sphere of resources is nowhere near enough for what they're trying to do. And so it is to some extent a human it's not like a very precisely defined concept. It, like you could say, like for humans, so you could say that we are already somewhat close in some respects. If you are like fortunate enough to live in a rich country and you have you're healthy and had a good education, like probably most of your listeners, like it's probably the case that if you wanted to, you wouldn't really have to work to survive. Or if you say you worked really hard for 5 or 10 years and saved up all the money, you probably could then move to Thailand or something and buy a small hut near a beach and then have enough to eat and be physically healthy, and you'd have a computer, you could access the internet or whatever for the rest of your life without having to work. Like, it's at least tantalizingly close. But yet people choose to continue to strive because they want more than just the basic necessities of life, right? Like, and in particular, we want to have more than other people. And so there's a lot of this kind of zero-sum status consumption going on with humans. And that could drive scarcity up to astronomical levels, right? Like you have your own Dyson sphere, but like I have 4 Dyson spheres. So like you still need to try to catch up, and an intergalactic civilization might have practical reasons as well. Like maybe they fear some other intergalactic civilization that might have a larger fleet of warships or something. And so, but the difference is like, even if human desires are insatiable, it doesn't mean there will always be a need for human work. Like you could reach a condition where even though like you maybe are worth $1 trillion and you would like to make another $1 trillion, there's just nothing you can do with your own labor that would make you any significant amount of money, because all the work is better done by machine. And if the most you could make is the minimum wage, then once you're a trillionaire, like there is no point really working, right? Because it's trivial compared to what you just earned from your capital. And it might even be that by doing the work yourself, you like expend more calories that cost you more than the actual value of the labor. So you could still end up in this kind of condition of unemployment or post-work, even if there are still needs that have, or desires that haven't been fully satisfied. Now, you asked whether I think there are already some that have attained either post-scarcity, or I guess you could generalize it to technological maturity. And I think if the universe is infinite, as it seems to be, like if we have the simplest topology and an open or flat space-time, then definitely that would be such civilizations. In fact, infinitely many of them out there. But if I had to guess, I'd say none in the observable universe, and so that there would be infinitely many of these, but they would have low density, and so we might be out of causal contact forever with the nearest other one. That certainly would help explain the Fermi paradox, but it's not the only possible explanation. So we can't rule out that we could share the observable universe with some other civilizations as well.
Speaking of intergalactic civilizations and intergalactic warfare, obviously that would be a huge barrier to us reaching a utopian state if we had to fend off an alien invasion. But do you see any other barriers beside just our ability to produce a super intelligent technology or a super intelligent AI? Other barriers beyond that to our reaching utopian states?
Yes. I mean, first of all, it would be crucial the superintelligence is well aligned, because otherwise, that might be our undoing. And second, if you have scenarios multipolar in character, like if you have many different entities ultimately with their own AI assistants, that then a lot of the same dynamics that we see on the planet today with arms races and oppression and warfare and exploitation of the global commons by sort of spewing pollutants into the atmosphere, overfishing the oceans, all of that could still occur and indeed could be intensified in this kind of hyper competitive economy that might be created. If, on the other hand, you don't have a multipolar, but like a unipolar, or as I call it, a singleton scenario where it gets all consolidated, then there's the obvious question of who controls that singleton, right? And how benevolent and wise is whatever the mechanism, whether it's like a global democracy or a dictatorship or whatever it is like. So I think one can identify several broad categories of things that need to fall in place. So one is to have this kind of deep utopia. You would need super advanced technology. Like otherwise you just can't do all of the, right now we can't cure the kid with a cancer in many cases, right? And that means our world falls short of what it should be. So the super advanced technology, but then I think also we'd need a fairly high level of cooperation / good governance to prevent sort of negative sum conflict. And then we'd also need some adequately high level of wisdom in how we use these great technological powers that we have. And it might be that the wisdom has a kind of threshold effect where if you're above that threshold, even if you're still unwise in many deep ways and have many erroneous beliefs and misconceptions, you might have enough wisdom to realize that you are fallible and to start to seek out ways to fix. You can reflect on your own shortcomings and gradually develop ways of remedying it. But if you're sort of below that wisdom level, you might be more likely to lock in your current prejudices or to shoot your foot off when you're trying to like develop ways to fix it. And it's kind of actually an open question, I think, where humanity is relative to that. Because you could ask the same question at the collective level. Like, are we, I think we're maybe close to the threshold level, but I'm not sure whether we're just under or just above it. And then we might need some bit of luck as well on top of that. But I think, although these are kind of extreme technological postulates and you might seem very wild ideas, I still think they might actually not be completely unrealistic even within our lifetime if this whole AI transition happens. And it's if you sort of zoom out and look at human history, from its inception, a few 100,000 years ago to today, and you plot that in any possible way you might want to, like whether it's like the amount of, the GDP, let us say, or like some sort of the energy expended by human civilization, or like, and then it does have this, if you plot it on a linear scale, you just see a flat line that just spikes up at the end of the graph. So then you have to go to like a log plot to even see it bending. But even then it bends up. And we're really sitting right now at this like ridiculous anomaly, where what we are currently taking to be the normal human condition is in any which way you look at it like just an extreme historical anomaly, like a tiny little thin coat of paint on a giant battleship of human history, right? It's like it, and then now we think it's like a radical conception to think, well, what if that changes in the future? Whereas in fact, if you sort of zoom out, you look like we are right now in the middle of this like explosion of something. We don't know what it's going to end up like, but I do believe, as you alluded to earlier, that scenarios in which we just remain more or less like we are now and have the current human condition just keep going for like tens of thousands of years, that just seems extremely improbable to me, relative to either like extinction / dystopia or some radical transformation into some kind of post-human condition.
Well, Nick, I really enjoyed Deep Utopia, and I came out of it with so many ideas and concepts that I hadn't considered beforehand. So thanks so much for writing the book and thinking about these really interesting, pressing problems. And thanks a lot for coming on the show to talk to me about it.
Well, thanks to you, and to the little cat there as well.